What's the ceiling for the Falcons defense, and is it good enough for them to make the playoffs?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Now, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Mr. AKA, and I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for a very long time, formerly at falcfans.com. RIP, still going strong on this podcast. Been podcasting for over a decade. Appreciate each and every one of you that go strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode is a mailbag episode. You'll love to see it. We'll answer some questions about Zac Robinson's implementation of more play action based off of things he said on a podcast of all places. You know, we'll talk about between Jalon Walker and James Pearce, who's going to be the more productive pass rusher as a rookie. Will gaining weight help James Pearce become better against the run? But we'll start off with a question about what is the potential ceiling and floor for this Falcons defense. And that question comes from one of our Locked On Falcons insiders. That's Alex S. And for those of you that are not insiders get preferential treatment. You know, they get precedent when it comes to priority. That was the P word that I was looking for when it comes to these mailbag episodes. And we'll probably have a couple of these sprinkled in between now and the start of training camp, and certainly in the start of the regular season. So join becoming a Locked On Falcons insider by hitting that link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons. It's a 14-day free trial, $4.99 a month. You get access to all my film breakdowns of all the Falcons draft picks. You'll get access to upcoming breakdowns when we talk about, you know, ways that this defense and offense can improve, all that and more. So that is in the link in the description. But Alex's first question is, after hearing more about the scheme and watching film on the rookies, what is your floor, eye level, and ceiling for this defense? So I would say the floor is probably the 28th defense. The ceiling is 16th, and the eye level, split the difference, is 22, right? And this is based off of DVOA. You know, we don't really use volume stats like yards and points allowed to measure defenses because not all yards and points are created equal, and advanced metrics like DVOA that you can find over at ftnfantasy.com, formerly Football Outsiders, you know, to me is more comprehensive and gives context to what type of yards and points you're allowing and whatnot. So why is the floor so low? You know, the main reason is, you know, this pass rush not necessarily making a massive leap. Now, they could make a massive leap, right? And I'm not going to bore you with all the math, but I looked up the top 7 or so pass rushers in terms of snaps for both the Jets and Falcons over the last 3 years. And on average, those guys is in terms of the guys that were rushing the quarterback the most in the top 7 were producing about 75% of the sacks for both teams across the last 3 years. And, you know, doing some high end and low end projections for who I think are likely to be the top 7 or just a base level of top 7. And the 7 I'm using are Arnold Ebiketie, Leonard Floyd, James Pearce, Jalon Walker, Rukaroro, David Onyemata, and Morgan Fox. You could also throw Zach Harrison potentially in that mix. You could throw Caden Ellis potentially in that mix and, you know, drop one or more of those guys. So we'll see on that front. So the math may change on that, but basically taking those numbers, the low end projection for sacks this year for the Falcons is about 28. The high end is about 48. Now, 28 sacks would have ranked dead last in the NFL in sacks. The Falcons had 31 and were, I think, 31st in the NFL in sacks last year. 48 would have ranked 5th in the NFL. Now, what I'll say is this: I would think it would be irresponsible of me to come on a Falcons podcast and tell you guys that the Falcons have the potential to be a top 5 or top 10 pass rush this year. We know that this franchise is cursed, right? All you got to do is look at all the pass rushers that are very productive elsewhere, that they come to Atlanta and the production falls off a cliff. Dante Fowler being a great example of that. Matthew Judon, Chris Dolman, Ray Edwards. It seems to be that this team is cursed when it comes to sack potential. So even though the math is saying that the Falcons might push 50 sacks this year, right? You know, I think the fact that they're cursed means that at best they're going to push maybe 45 sacks this upcoming season. And that's why I tend to say their ceiling is more 16th than higher than that. should they have a more productive pass rush, because the average number of sacks in the NFL the last 3 years has been about 42 sacks. So 45 would put them roughly slightly above that. So when we think about, that's kind of the front sort of handled, and the front I think is going to be driving a lot of this team's defensive success. But when we look at the back seven, right, you could get your low end or high end outcomes depending on what your three best proven guys at linebacker, corner, and safety, and Jesse Bates, Caden Ellis, and AJ Terrell do, right? And then who else steps up, right? Now, if you get down years from all of those guys, those won't be bad seasons, right? If Bates, Terrell, and Ellis have down years, those would be good seasons by NFL standards, but maybe they're B level seasons or whatever. And then if the rest of your back seven, produces like C and D level performances, that's where you get a back end that, in addition to a pass rush that is bottom 5, potentially could be a bottom 10 back end, right? Now, the best case scenario is you get A levels type seasons from Bates, Terrell, and Ellis. Maybe you sprinkle in a couple of Bs elsewhere, on your back end, and then everybody else is kind of a C. And that's where you get that league average sort of back end coupled with the league average pass rush, and that's where you get the 16. So to me, like when we're having a conversation about how much improvement is this defense going to make under Jeff Ulbrich, the expectation is that they will make some improvement, right? Because they were at 28th in DVOA last year. And again, that's the floor for what we're talking about. And to me, we're really going to be judging Jeff Ulbrich and how good of a job he did based off of how, high or below that eye level rank of 22 this defensive finishes, right? If we get better than average coaching, we'll finish above 22. If we get average coaching, we'll be 22. And if we get subpar coaching, we'll be below 22 in terms of that. And again, that's probably a contributing factor to why a lot of people perceive, this podcast as being so full of negativity, right? They don't call me Mr. Drew. My friends call me Negative Nancy, but you can call me Mr. Drew for nothing. And it often, I think, stems from differing perceptions on what the floor and the ceiling for this team is, right? Like, if you think their floor on defense is 22 and their ceiling is like 8, then, you think their eye level is 15, while I think that's probably closer to their ceiling, right? And you imagine a scenario where, spitballing, not doing a deep dive on this, maybe we'll do it at a later date. But offensively, like if I think their ceiling offensively is like 5 and their floor is like 22, that probably puts their eye level around 12, 13-ish range, right? And if you combine, an eye level or an outcome of the 12th best offense with the 22nd best defense, which is the average expectations, that's probably a team that's going to finish 7 to 9 wins this year. And depending on, do they get more breaks than not, is a 9-win team versus a 7-win team, right? Now, in the best case scenario where the team is a top 5 offense and a top 16 defense, that's probably a team that should win 10 to 12 games, right? If you look at their low end expectations, which is worst case scenario, 22nd best offense, 28th best defense, that's probably a team that wins 4 to 6 games. And so, for a lot of people, they probably go into it where their floor for this team is where I think the eye level is, particularly the folks that tend to be a lot more optimistic to me. And there's probably a lot of people that think their ceiling is where I think their eye level is, right? And so, those are where expectations differ. But, to piggyback on to a similar question, Locked On Falcons Insider Cody says, what's the Falcons ceiling if they lead the NFL in sacks? Well, that should be pretty obvious, Cody. So, I'm assuming you're trolling me asking this, as some of you guys decide to do when you sign up as Locked On Falcons Insiders. I do not endorse that behavior, but, if you're paying me money, then, I'm not going to complain. But, I think it should be obvious that a team that is the best pass rush in the NFL probably is a Super Bowl contender at that point in time, assuming that, you're not the Pittsburgh Steelers offense or anything like that. So, this is why I can't sit here and talk about the Falcons getting 50 plus sacks, because some of y'all fantasize a little bit too much. And again, we don't kink shame here on the podcast. If when you're laying your head down at night at 2 a.m. in the dark and you're fantasizing about the Falcons leading the NFL in sacks, then hey, more power to you. But I'm going to sit here and tell you, like, I'm not going to show my feet for free, if you get what I'm saying. So that's why I don't come on this free platform, this free and available on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, and show my feet by telling you guys, oh, we're going to get 50 or 60 sacks. Now, we can go to certain websites that, you can pay a little bit more premium, and beyond the Locked On Falcons Insider program, if you want me to show feet, then we can get into that, but you got to pay for it. So So that's where we'll leave it. And I'm sure there's going to be a couple of people that will cancel the Locked On Falcons. Again, I'm not showing feet on Locked On Falcons Insiders, although I'm open to it. Okay. Okay, we're getting out of pocket, guys. So we got another question from Alex about James Pearce's weight gain, and we'll get into whether or not that's going to make a difference for him in run defense moving forward. And that's what we'll break down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So we love the NBA playoffs and the finals, the intensity, the buzzer beaters, and there's nothing better than getting in the arena, and Gametime is going to help you do that. Whether you're here to see Thunder versus Pacers, or, if you're not necessarily in the Oklahoma or Indiana markets, you're trying to get to other live events, and Gametime is going to make it easier for you to get tickets for sports, baseball, upcoming football season, comedy, music, theater, whatever event is near you. And you can take the guesswork out of buying those tickets by downloading Gametime app and create an account and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off. Download the Gametime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. So Alex's next question is, do you think James Pearce could gain a certain amount of weight that would make any difference in his run support, or is it just regular NFL weight gain from working out with better trainers? So if you haven't heard, James Pearce said during mandatory minicamp to reporters that he is heavier than he was during the offseason. So around combine time, he didn't put an exact number on what his current weight is or what his target weight will be. He just basically said, I'm figuring it out as we go. So I think that's leads to a lot of people wondering, okay, what will this do for James Pearce, given that he's technically undersized, right? And does it make a difference? Sure. Do I think it's a significant difference? Not really. And basically the way I would explain it is like currently, probably based off of the college film, James Pearce, I would say it's probably like a 3 out of 10 run defender, right? If you add some mass to him, maybe that gets it to 4 out of 10. And if you get him to actually care about run defense, which was, I think, probably a bigger issue than, maybe not a bigger issue, but like also a equal issue, stopping the run, then maybe that goes from a 4 out of 10 to a 5 out of 10. So to me, like 5 out of 10 as a run defender is probably good enough to be a functional every down player if you're an impactful pass rusher, if you're a 7 out of 10 or better pass rusher. And right, the examples I would use is like Micah Parsons, right? Micah Parsons is probably like a 4 or 5 out of 10 run defender, but because he's a 10 out of 10 pass rusher, no one cares, right? And that's an extreme example, but like Brian Burns is another example. And Burns was my ceiling comp for James Pearce. And you would probably say Burns on a good day is probably a 9 out of 10 pass rusher, but most days is probably an 8 out of 10 pass rusher. And he plays most snaps, even though he's probably a 5 out of 10 run defender. And again, the pass rush success offsets any sort of concerns with the run defense. And basically, if Pearce can get to a similar level as a pass rusher, then ultimately you're not going to really care that he's a 4 or 5 out of 10 run defender, right? And so it's just levels to the pass rush ability. Like if Pearce is an 8 out of 10 pass rusher, then he's probably going to play every snap. And you're not going to worry about the run defense. And then you're probably wondering, okay, what does an 8 out of 10 pass rusher translate to? Well, let's just look at the PFF data and the pressures, right? An 80th percentile edge rusher would get about 52 pressures last year. And you look at an average sack conversion rate of 15%, which is the percentage of pressures that lead to sacks. That would result in about 8.5 or roughly 8 sacks, right? A 7 out of 10 guy would be about 44 pressures, 6.5 sacks. 6 out of 10 would be about 37 pressures, 5.5 sacks. 5 out of 10 would be about 31 pressures, 4.5 sacks. And, you need to be concerned if Pearce doesn't reach that 7 out of 10 or better level. And again, we're not expecting him to reach that immediately in year one, but, hopefully by the end of year 3, he's at least a 7 out of 10 pass rusher, because if he doesn't reach that level, then it's going to be hard to justify getting him on the field because his pass rush is not balancing out whatever deficiencies he has against the run. And then even if he's just a 6 out of 10 pass rusher and just a DPR, a designated pass rusher that basically only plays on obvious passing situations, 6 out of 10 isn't good enough to really carve out a role for a DPR. Like you want your DPR to be a 7 or above. And a lot of that is due to, and I know it sounds crazy to hear from a Falcon fan saying this, but 6 out of 10 pass rushers aren't that hard to find. Like that hasn't really been an issue for the Falcons finding those types of guys over the years, right? Arnold Ebiketie, Vic Beasley, Tack McKinley, Calais Campbell, Bud Dupree, those guys have all been like 6 out of 10 guys, but they haven't really had a guy since John Abraham that was a 7 out of 10 or more. The closest so far has been Calais Campbell in his 23 season, right? And so if Pearce can't reach that 7 out of 10, like it doesn't make him a bust or anything. Like my eye level comp for James Pearce, my ceiling comp was Brian Burns. My eye level was Leonard Floyd. And if you look at what Leonard Floyd was in Chicago for his rookie contract for those 4 years, he was probably a 6 out of 10 pass rusher, right? And so that didn't make Leonard Floyd a bust, but he certainly didn't become a cornerstone piece of that Bears defense, right? And, that contributed to the Bears why they were willing to trade for all those assets for Khalil Mack to be more of that ace pass rusher. It's why the Bears didn't, bend over backwards to re-sign Leonard Floyd in that same offseason. When they let Leonard Floyd walk to the Rams, they went out and paid a pretty penny to go out there and get Robert Quinn, who they felt like was going to be a massive upgrade and did not prove to be that this year. So getting back to the initial topic, I don't think Pierce's weight gain, or even if we want to throw Jalen Walker into that conversation, is all that meaningful, because at the end of the day, their success and failure in the NFL hinges on their pass rush ability, right? And I don't think adding mass is really going to change the math all that much for James Pearce, right? You're going from a 3 or 4 out of 10 run defender, you're not going from there to like a 6 or 7 out of 10 just because you add 10 or 15 pounds, right? It would be different if maybe your starting point was a 6 out of 10 pass rusher, and then adding that mass could get you maybe the 7 or 8, and that is a lot more meaningful. I think that you can argue that's kind of the situation that Zach Harrison found himself coming into the NFL with, and why his weight gain I think was a little bit more instrumental to his improvement last year because of that run defense ability. But it's why I don't spend that much time talking about, like Walker and Pearce, they just bulk up, that'll solve some problems. Like it'll make improvements on the margins, which is necessary, but like, I don't think it's the needle mover that other people think it's going to be. And, I've gotten lots of pushback on that from various listeners of this podcast in the comments and elsewhere where, and I think that's a big reason why you're asking this question, Alex, because other people seem to be talking about the potential weight gain of these guys more so than I am, whether we're talking about Pearce, whether we're talking about Walker, and I'm sure even Watson and Bowman to an extent, given that they're not the biggest or strongest guys, right? I've seen various comments about several of these guys where it's like, well, they're going to get an NFL weight room and they're going to get stronger, so your concerns about their lack of size is bunk or whatever. And it's like, yes, they will probably get stronger in NFL weight room, but I don't think it's solving the problems that I think a lot of other people seem to think it is, because if it was, and this was a normal sort of thing to expect in the NFL, it would be a lot more common. We would look around the league and we would see the NFL full of guys that came into the league undersized, put on some bulk, and quote unquote fixed whatever issues that they were dealing with. But we don't really see that often. I'm not saying we'd never see that, but it's not that common in the NFL, right? There's a reason why a lot of these sub 250 pound edges like Pearson, like Walker, we don't sit here, 2-3 years later and be like, oh, these guys are plus run defenders. And you're not like, whether we're talking about Parsons or Bryce Huff or Brian Burns or Carl Lawson or Hassan Reddick or whatever, we're not talking about, the world's best run defenders, right? We're still talking about guys that are considered quote unquote liabilities or lacking against the run, even though they've gotten stronger and been in NFL weight rooms for several years. So that's why, like, for me, the whole idea of like, oh, we'll just put, however many pounds on James Pearce and it will solve problems. Like, it'll help, don't get me wrong, but I don't think it's solving the problem. I hope that answers your question, Alex. But, we're not done talking about James Pearce and Jalen Walker. Let's talk about, these baby-sized edge rushers and what they're going to do year one as pass rushers. Who's going to be the more productive of the two? And we'll get into all of that as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So our insider Ryan asks, thoughts on which rookie pass rusher will be more productive year one in moving forward. So this is something I was planning on doing a deeper dive on at some point this summer to give some accurate projections for what these guys are. But, before we do a deep dive and look at the numbers and all that stuff and do all the research, I'll give you sort of my initial thoughts on it. So as far as like rushing from the edge, right, I think Pearce is going to be ahead of Walker in that regard. I think he's a perfect fit in this wide 9 attacking scheme and using that speed off the edge, which I think this scheme is really going to accentuate, is going to allow James Pearce to maximize that as an edge rusher. But at the same time, if Walker is to move inside and have him rush more in that quote unquote Caden Ellis role as a off-ball linebacker rushing through the A and B gaps, I would not at all be shocked that his production winds up being higher than James Pearce's in the end, just because he's facing essentially a lower level of competition, right? That playing that off-ball role, he's rushing against running backs and guards and centers, which those guys are easier to beat than offensive tackles, right? That, theoretically, if Jalen Walker, like you think of week one, if James Pearce and Jalen Walker both line up on, the right side of the defense against the left side of the Bucks offensive line, James Pearce is going to be facing Tristan Wirfs, who's arguably the best offensive lineman, period, if not the best offensive tackle in the league right now, right? Versus Jalen Walker is going to be facing Ben Bredesen, who's probably the worst starting guard in the NFC South. He's not a bad player by any means, but we're talking more like a 5 out of 10 blocker versus a 10 out of 10. And like, again, who's got an easier job to win in that situation? It's Jalen Walker. And so that to me is essentially what we're talking about. And we've talked about this a ton with Caden Ellis, where Caden Ellis's production as an edge rusher, when he lines up there, is far lower than it is when he lines up on the interior, right? We look at next gen stats, right? Ellis's pressure rate as an edge rusher is 9.5%, according to next gen stats. His pressure rate when he was lining up at D tackle or linebacker, so basically in either the A gap or off ball, was 23.5%. And for the sake of comparison, the highest pressure rate from anybody rushing from the edge rusher position, according to next gen stats last year, was Micah Parsons at 19.5%. So well below Caden Ellis's interior rush pressure rate of 23.5%. And the highest from a full-time D tackle rushing from the D tackle spot was Quinnen Williams at over 12%. And for the sake of argument, in that 9% edge rush pressure rate that Caden Ellis had, is very similar to the the overall pressure rates of Matthew Judon last year, Bud Dupree in 2023, and Lorenzo Carter in 2022, where all of those guys basically had a pressure rate overall of 9 to 10%. In those years. And so those are guys that aren't necessarily needle movers when it comes to your pass rush. Or those are guys that are solid rotational pieces, but they're not the guys that are going to be the main threats at that group. And so when it comes to Jalen Walker, to me, it is an open question as we sit here today. And we'll find out when the guys hit the field later this summer and this season. But that's one of my big questions about Jalen Walker. Is he more Caden Ellis than I think people realize, which is he's going to be another guy that, yeah, he can generate decent pressure. He could be a Lorenzo Carter type of edge rusher, similar to what Caden Ellis could be. But if he's really going to be an impactful pass rusher, he's going to be much more effective going up against guards, centers, and running backs, rushing through the A gap and B gap, right? And being that real difference maker as an interior rusher and whatnot. And so to me, there's definitely a world where Jalen Walker outshines James Pearce because he's getting a lot more of those opportunities to rush as an interior guy, where I sit here basically with Jalen Walker, I feel pretty confident that he can win on the interior. I'm not as confident that he can win on the outside, right? And so that to me is going to be a question about ultimately his success in the league, right? Can he be the guy? Now, if he can be a guy that can win not only on the outside and on the interior, that's where all the Micah Parsons hype comes from, where Micah Parsons can line up anywhere and win regardless of where you put him. And again, not saying Jalen Walker is going to be the next Micah Parsons, which again, I think it's being a little bit ridiculous, comparing a guy to one of the biggest outliers in NFL history, but could be some version of Micah Parsons, 70% of Micah Parsons or whatever. And that still is probably, one of the best pass rushers in the NFL. So those are some of my questions with Jalen Walker. But to answer the question, it just really depends on opportunity, right? Hypothetically, let's say both James Pearce and Jalen Walker each get 200 pass rushing opportunities, pass rushing snaps this year to rush the quarterback. And let's say Pearce gets all of those at edge rusher and has a pressure rate comparable to, going into year one of 9%. And again, we hope that number grows over time and can get, in the 10, 12, 15 or higher percent range in the future. But, if let's say it's 9% this year with 200 opportunities, that's about 18 pressures this year. Let's say Walker gets the same number of snaps, 200, but 150 of those come at edge, and then 50 of those come in the interior. And let's say his pressure rate at edge is 8%, right? And then let's say his pressure rate on the interior is like 25%, which would be slightly above what Key Nellis's was. That would result in 25 pressures. Even if you lowered the threshold to 20% on the interior and like 6%, I think, if my math checks on the outside, that still would be more pressures. That would be, I think that would result in 19 pressures to Pearce's 18 pressures. So again, that's where, to me, the potential for Walker, even though I think Pearce as a pure edge rusher is a ways ahead of Jalen Walker, that to me is where Jalen Walker could potentially outshine him if he gets those interior rush opportunities. Or, Jalen Walker could wind up being a much better edge rusher than, I'm giving him credit for currently as he gets on the field. So that's also an opportunity. But I think a lot of it in terms of who's going to be the more productive of the two is going to depend on how they're used and what type of opportunities that they're going to get. So our next question comes from Jeremy T. He asks, what are some key strategic changes the Falcons need to make on both sides of the ball for the upcoming season? And also, in your opinion, do they make any more roster moves? So for offense, to me, I want to see more play action, as I'm sure many of you could guess. For defense, I just kind of want to see them be a little bit more aggressive on early downs. Like if you look at next gen stats, their blitz rates on first, second and third down, the Falcons last year were 24th on first down, 19th on second down, 12th on third down. You compare that to the Jets last year, they were 12th on first down, 17th on second down, 7th on third down. And, when I say aggressive, I don't mean just blitzing. I want to see more man coverage, right? I charted it last year, and it probably was a higher number overall if I just wasn't factoring targeted throws where just a receiver was targeted, so not counting sacks or scrambles or throwaways or whatever. But before the bye week, there were only 9 snaps that I charted the first 11 games of the season or 9 non-red zone snaps where the Falcons on first down were playing man coverage based off my charting, just 9 times, right? And like 3 of those, I think, came in the Seahawks game. So they were regularly averaging less than 1 per game throughout the first 2/3 of the season. And like that just, to me, like that's just so vanilla, right? It's part of that whole passive bend but don't break philosophy that they had. And like, to me, it didn't work because like the Falcons didn't have the horses, and I still don't know if they have the horses to operate that way. Like the Rams were able to get away with that under Raheem Morris because they had a top 7 offense at their best, and that was reliably able to score 24, 26, 27 or more points every single week. And so that changes the math for what your defense, you can bend a lot more and give up 23 points and still win those games. And they also had, the Rams also had the other thing that went for them was Aaron Donald, right? Where that, you can be a little bit more passive because on any given down, you have a guy that is the biggest butt kicker, one of the biggest butt kickers in NFL history out there kicking butt. And like the Falcons don't really have that. Again, we're hoping that they have a top 5 to 7 offense, but as good as I think, some of these young guys have the potential to be, Aaron Donald's not walking through that door at this stage. So it's one of those things where like I think you have to offset that a little bit with being a little bit more aggressive. Now, to answer your second question in terms of do they need to make any more roster moves? They don't necessarily need to. Should they? Sure. But like to me at this stage in the offseason, like the options available aren't necessarily guys that I'm like, oh, I'm beating down the door to sign those guys. Like, again, if the Falcons were to go out there and sign a Jair Alexander or a Jalen Ramsey or Asante Samuel, a cornerback or something like that, like I wouldn't sit here and be like, that's a bad move or anything like that. But like, I don't feel like, I feel like there's enough young pieces. Like for me, I'll let you guys in on a little secret. Like I don't have, as you probably could have guessed, so it's not that much of a secret, but like, I don't have that high expectations for this team this upcoming season. I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm sitting here singing the praises, but like, to me, like the goal for me this season is just kind of see like, what do you have in some of these young pieces so that theoretically, if you don't live up to your expectations this year and you bring in a brand new regime, that regime is not coming in, that regime is starting out on like first or second base, so to speak, right? Where you have a lot of young pieces and you can feel a lot better about their ability to build off of that. That's kind of my main hope for this upcoming season. Like I'm not going into it with playoff aspirations. Again, I would love to be wrong about that, but at least as we sit here today, like to me, my hope and optimism is like, let's see what some of these young guys. And so that's why I'm not like gung-ho, like we got to go out there and sign this veteran player that's going to solve this problem. Because it's like, we've been there. We've done that before. And I just kind of want to let's get these young guys some opportunities to see what they can do, and see what some of these, day one and day two defensive players that we've drafted over the last 3-4 years, are they actually worth a darn or not? But our last question comes from Alex J. He said, did you catch Z-Rob's comments about working play action in his interview on Check the Mic a few weeks back? He brought up play action twice, unprompted, as a 2025 goal for improvement. Do we have reason to be hopeful for Zac Robinson to better match the run fits to the play action opportunities? So yes, I did hear him talk about that, but my thing is actions speak louder than words. Alex, they said last year going into the bye week, they were going to address the play action. They didn't really address it. So again, they can say all the right things, but you got to prove it on the field. So, in terms of how hopeful should you be, you certainly should be more hopeful than you would be if he didn't say anything, if he didn't go on a podcast and say it said nothing about the play action, right? But, it's kind of meaningless talk. It's talk, right? I expect this team to be better in play action, but the question to me is how much better, right? We can look at the numbers, right? Again, looking at next gen stats, right? The Falcons EPA per pass on play action plays last year was 25th last year. Right? They could be better and be 18th, but 18th is probably not good enough to make the playoffs, right? Because if you look at the average EPA per pass off of play action over the last 3 years for playoff teams, it's about 13th, right? And when you look at the average EPA per playoff per pass off of play action, say that 10 times fast, for an NFC team last year, that would have required you to be like the 9th best team in that regard. So basically, you got to go from a bottom 10 play action passing team to a top 10 play action passing team to maximize your playoff chances. And like Zac Robinson going on a podcast saying that we're working on it, like, to me, like, you got to go out there and do it, is essentially. So it's talk at this point in time. But if they can actually go out there and do it, depending on how much stock you put in the talk, right? If you think that's meaningful, then, and you think that's going to lead to a top 10 play action unit this year, then by all means, be very hopeful about it. But I need a little bit more to go off of that. So that is going to do it for us on today's mailbag episode. Those weren't the only questions. We got a great one from Marcus, who asked about the chances of keeping Raheem and firing Terry if the Falcons miss the playoffs again this year. And we may get into that tomorrow on the podcast. So other ones came from the Locked On Falcons Insider. So if you want to make sure your questions get answered on future episodes, become a Locked On Falcons Insider at the link in the description below. If you don't want to become a Locked On Falcons Insider and be worried about some feet pics being sent your way, you can find other ways to submit questions. You can email me at lockedonfalcons@mail.com, or you can join the Discord in the link in the description below. So that is going to do it for us here, guys. Continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen by checking us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. For your second listen, check out the Locked On NFL Scouting podcast, where Joe and Kyle are going to make you the most informed fans you could be all summer long. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every